And we're here,
We are here. Well, I
wherever
mean,
here
we're
is.
we're right. We're in the virtual room of
Yes,
here, and it's Gen GMs.
that's
We are here.
right.
That is Zach Clay on the West
Mm-hmm.
Coast.
Yep, and that is Gregory Wilson on the East Coast, I think. Yeah.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the East Coast. You can. I don't know, like my terrible webcam on my computer on my laptop. I'm
Yeah.
in my office,
Mm-hmm.
and that flag is the St. John's University flag
Nice.
that is over my shoulder. And it's my final day of the semester. I did my last final about 2 hours ago or something. So I did all I have to do now is just literally input final grades, which I will do when I get home tonight. So yeah, so Zach, I am covered in the educational, the semester that is completed, and then the students have been educated and their minds have been uplifted, and
Wow.
like that's the deal. So I'm feeling good about
Great.
this. So,
Feeling covered in educational semester right now. That's great.
basically, yeah. But yeah, so just one thing quickly, which is to thank everybody who has been watching and commenting. And please do, we would love it if you can spread the word via the YouTube shorts and TikToks and all that stuff. And by the time you see this, it's going to be probably over a month from now. But
Yeah.
in video, I think we should just acknowledge that we have a video editor
Right.
now, whose handle is live suing, and that is as much as we will out the name. But Live is a good guy and has done a great job, and so we are very excited to have a video editor on board
Mm-hmm.
and be all professional and stuff like that.
Yeah, and specifically, they've been editing down the sort of like short form content from these long videos.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe someday we'll create epic edits for these hour long episodes that we do.
Yeah.
Um,
All the like the slam cuts and just
yeah,
that's
slam
because
cuts and insert of sponsors when and
yeah,
if we
yeah.
get those, and intro music and outro music.
And like big smash boom, hits, comic hits.
Love it.
We will
Yeah,
do that. But anyway, so thank you,
someday.
Livestream, for being who you are.
Yeah.
Um, so I got a question for you, Zach, because
All
that's what we
right.
do on the show.
Yep.
And this is inspired by the educational environment that we have previously discussed.
That you're covered in.
Um, so you and I both do work in education relating to gaming as well.
Yeah.
And you work with the program in San Francisco as part of the library, the Bay Area library system with the kids there.
Right.
And you've also done stuff with, WotC has like highlighted your work with kids. So what I want to ask you is, we talk about this sort of in general terms of sort of like D&D is good for, this and that and the other thing. I want to ask you, what exactly have you found uh, D&D and GMing and DMing does for kids? What does teaching them to DM teach them the most in specific
Mm.
terms, if you can? What is it maybe that it taught you as you were sort of getting into D&D, but also what have you tried to what has it done for students, if you will, like people in your programs, kids in your programs? What does it teach them, do you think?
So I'll start because one of the parts of that question you asked was what does it do for me? So I'll start with me and then I'll branch out into what I've observed.
Okay.
So yeah, I only started DMing since 2016 or so, a year after I graduated high school. God, I still gotta show off that I'm still so young, a little bit,
It's
but
true.
before it's too late.
That
Um,
was, when I was like 13 years into teaching here. So that was a little different for me.
yeah, a little different. That's the Gen GMs part for you.
Yep, there you go.
But
Branding.
I mean, for me, I would say one of the biggest things I recently got the opportunity through the San Francisco Public Library branch system. I think SFPL has like 28 branches of libraries or something like that, like a
Wow.
lot.
Okay.
Not as many as Chicago, actually. Chicago has like 50 plus or something, some ridiculous number of branches in
Yeah, and New
Chicago.
York has a lot too, but I mean those are
Yeah,
huge cities. So like,
right, right.
yeah.
And I did a training recently where I was to train these different branches on how we do our program at the main branch and
Hmm.
how we start things and run this program. And I was telling them about my experience as a DM and how that relates to these kids' experiences. So the one of the main things I'll point out for how it's been beneficial for me already starts to relate to how it's been beneficial for the kids, in that I think one of the unique things about DMing is that you play multiple characters. And that's a very simple idea, but to dive deeper into that, each player at the table, that's not the DM, just plays a character, a single character.
Mhm.
And they spend a lot of time on that character's backstory and how to role play them and what their mannerisms are like, and how they are in comparison to their real life selves. But as the GM, you have to go from playing a wacky merchant that they meet in one town to the evil villain that is a
Yep.
dragon to
Yep.
the goblin that they meet to the ominous voice of one of the warlock's patrons to this and that and this and that. And so when I did this training for the branches, I did a PowerPoint each week for each branch as part of this training that I came up with, and to kind of show them how when you're a GM, it's a very unique and it's a role that prompts a lot of growth in yourself because you're playing and passing through so many different identities. So in
Mhm.
my PowerPoint, I was like, huh. And I went back through, I download a bunch of art from, WotC licensed stuff like D&D or Magic the Gathering for my characters that I use in my games online. And so I just like grabbed all the files of every single piece of artwork from MTG or D&D that I had
Mhm.
downloaded for characters in a single campaign, and threw them on that PowerPoint slide and had it so that it would autoplay through them. And there were like 50 or 60 pieces of art,
Nice.
all characters that I have embodied, very different, from an aboleth to a arch druid to everything in between.
Mhm.
And I was telling them just like the effect of that, seeing all so many different creatures and so many different beings and genders and identities and voices and species and everything, really put into perspective for all of us. I mean, even as I was making it, I was like, wow, like what a gift it is to be able to embody so many different things and so many different aspects of yourself. Um, and I think that's one of the biggest benefits it's been to me, is to be able to use D&D as a theater to not just have to be the picture of myself that everyone else sees every day. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
So I can embody, being wacky or silly in a specific way that I might not usually be, or being more feminine or being more masculine, or taking on a strange voice, or being slightly more evil. Or I was listening to something, an interview that Brennan Lee Mulligan did, where he made a great analogy talking about how when you're role playing as a character, the character's like stained glass, and the role player, are the light that shines through the stained glass. So it's still
Hmm.
you, but it's colored differently and
Yeah, that's
it's
interesting.
filtered differently. And the GM, it has so many different panels of stained glass that they go through in a single session, versus a single player just has the one that they go through.
Right.
So that's the biggest beneficial thing for me. I feel one that I could point out is just the idea of being able to embody so many different personalities and aspects of myself and perspectives.
Mhm.
But with the kids, I mean, I'll have to stop myself from talking for too long because there's just so many. I mean, even just yesterday, every week I run this program, and when I was there yesterday, when you're working with 8 to 13 year olds is the age group that we run D&D for. You that I sometimes forget, and my experience as an educator is increasing as I realize more and more how much they don't know yet, and how really valuable and respectful and um, careful I must be with the care that is like the education of an 8-year-old human being.
Right. Right.
It is an incredible honor, to have these parents are like, so they'll just drop their kids off and be like, go have fun. And the parents, many of whom, they're not very much, you hear about the satanic panic and all that stuff back in the 80s and 70s, 80s and 90s and all that stuff. But the parents they just know that it's a great program and that D&D is wonderful and it's a social event, and they see how much fun their kids are having. So they trust us to do our job.
I
Um,
suppose San Francisco may help a little bit in being
yeah, and San
not an
Francisco's a
area
little,
of
sure, yeah,
retrograde,
that's true.
political
Um,
opinions.
but
But
even
no, you're
despite,
right though. Yeah.
yeah, despite that, then when the kids come in and I'm like, wow, I was trying to show them that other DMs exist online because I realized again, their only experience with D&D is this program, many of them. They don't even
Yeah.
know that, I showed them a video that I hoped they might recognize either of these people. Like Matt Mercer ran a game for, oh God, I can't remember his name right now. Not Jimmy Kimmel,
Stephen Colbert.
Stephen
Yep.
Colbert.
Yep.
I got them all mixed up in my head. So I showed them that video because I was like, it was an example of solo GMing
Yep.
with one player, and then I was like, that's Stephen Colbert from the Tonight Show. I put that video up, and I turned back to look at this group of 20 average 10-year-olds, and there was absolutely no reaction. They had no idea who Stephen Colbert was, and no idea who Matt Mercer was. And I pointed at it and was like, that's the most famous dungeon master in the whole world. And they were like, really? Who's that? And so that just put into perspective
Yeah. Yeah.
things like that. I only bring this up because it's occurring to me more and more just how, there was a while there where I've taught youth since I was still one and arguably still am kind of, but I taught middle schoolers when I was still in high school. So I was only 15 or 16 teaching kids that were only 3 or 4 years younger than me. And now it's starting to finally hit where I'm seeing the great differences between our generations. Um, and so I only bring that up because even just yesterday, when I was doing this program, we had a situation come up where one kid um, has an ability that is like a terrifying roar, and it specifies that you can choose who you want to terrify around you. It's supposed to get enemies to run away from you. But they thought it would be funny to use this terrifying roar on their friends. And so again, there's a
Like you
certain
do.
amount. Yeah. So there's a certain amount where I'm like, I'm going to let things play out so that we can see what the consequences are. So she decided to do that. And then, of course, most everyone else at the table got really, really mad at them. And then they were like, I go over and bonk them on the head. Or another player was like, I want to stab them with my sword. And then the player who did the terrifying roar did not understand why their friends would be mad and then got mad at them. And then there was this whole situation, this whole argument of the kids mad at each other and wanting retribution and revenge. And the kid who did the roar not acknowledging that maybe terrifying your friends would make them mad and therefore they will try to have some sort of reprise against you.
Yeah.
Um, so part of it, one of the biggest things in this incredibly long-winded answer, is teaching empathy. Uh, Also, the stakes of that situation where a very real argument was happening, but it was an argument over a situation that dissolves the moment you stand up and leave from the table.
Hmm.
The situation resolves. Now, the very true part is that the feelings that we carry about the argument, even if the what stays at the table, all of the other W words go with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
The who, the why, all that. Um, but we resolved it, and part of how that was achieved was through explanation, as I was the only adult at the table. Because one of the complaints of the original player who did the terrifying roar was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't have targeted them, but now they're going to kill me. And then I was like, okay, well, as a GM, there should be, yes, some balance of like you do something intentionally to do harm or to annoy your friends. They may then do that back to you just as a fact of life. But as a GM, I will step in when it comes to I'm not going to let you guys kill each other. We're not going to let that go so far that we're just not having any fun anymore. Um, and I explained to them too that, when you're at a table with adults, there can be player versus player action all the time, but
Yeah.
everyone is very clear about what they want and what they like. Um, and that was a learning moment for them. I also, it felt at a point I paused and I had this conversation with them where I was like, I asked all of this whole table, I was like, why do we play this game? At this table of 10-year-olds. And they were like, to have fun, but then they each started listing more of the things that they thought I wanted to hear, but also that they knew were true, that like it's problem solving, that they can work together as a team, that they can make believe, they go on adventures. And I was telling them, part of what my goal is and my lesson is when we play these games once a week, every week, is not just to have fun, but also to have them use this as a sandbox for life, for them to
Right.
improve as humans and to learn and to have interactions that help them learn how to interact with other people. Um, and we ended that session with all of them like closer together and more unified than they had been before, because as it
Hmm.
just so happened, that conflict, that little spout between the players happened right before the final boss room. And so they were in the hallway, like just about to have an epic team confrontation against an evil lich in the middle of the dungeon. And then they started fighting each other. We resolved that whole situation. And then the end of the session was amazing because they all then worked together and like unified their abilities to
Huh.
fight this final boss. So that's where I'll scoop this idea up and pass it back over before I keep going any longer. But just the idea, even from an example of that, of I don't know. It really, I think at their age, is a learning mechanism for social ability and being sociable and problem solving. Yes, problem solving the puzzles in the game and the encounters in the game. And like just the day before that, actually, so 2 days ago, I did a random gig at a client's home in San Francisco, and I incorporated a puzzle I had never used before to great success. It was really awesome. It was like a maze that also you had to step on certain squares. So not
Hmm.
only was it navigating the maze, but you also had to figure out what order to go in. And
Hmm.
it was great. And I loved watching them all sort of like figure out what to do. And there was a sort of a natural time where like one person failed, but then they learned something. So then they were like, okay, let me not try again. I'm going to give it to you. And they were all like, 13 years old on average. So I don't know. I think it's just a great tool for them to have some core memories, as we would say, in Inside Out. To start to learn a little bit more. And I'd like to think that at the table that I ran yesterday of all those young people and that problem that arose of one person scaring their friends intentionally as a joke, but then the
Hmm.
others wanting retribution, and then that person being like, well, wait, I wasn't that serious. And then they were getting upset. Once we resolved all of that, on each side of like, okay, you got to acknowledge that what you're doing is maybe a little annoying to your friends. And then also, friends, when this happens, if someone just scares you and you have to run away for 12 seconds in game, your response doesn't need to be, I go over to them and stab them through the heart.
I obliterate and annihilate their family,
Yeah.
right?
And both sides looked at me and they were like, yeah. And it's a struggle for me sometimes because of course in my mind, like that's never happened at any table of adults I've played with. Our problems are unfortunately usually more complex. But just basic like, empathy and understanding of like if you do something to harm your friends that normally among a table of adults, people wouldn't even like want retribution. They just kind of like store that for later. They'd be like, that person scared me. I'm not going to play with them again or something. But
Hmm.
kids are just so, you know, they have no filter with their emotions or how they feel or what they want to do. So, yeah. So I'd say that's the effect that story and what I danced around and the idea of it and just the idea that they they learn things, they have real experiences when the what of the, what is the problem, what is at stake is imaginary and oftentimes very fun. I mean, that was just one moment of conflict between the players, but the whole rest of the session they were laughing really, really hard and
Yeah.
having an amazing time and so yeah, I'd say that's the point. I mean, I could continue to give it examples literally for the next 5 hours. But that would be the main thing is just having these experiences in a place that is safe and um, with stakes that are imaginary, but social moments and with people that are very real.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's been my experience. And I guess as we stay in this in the same vein of that, as I've answered that question, I would pass it back to you lightly in the idea that I'm not sure how much you've run for younger kids. I mean, I'm sure you've run for your own kids a couple times before, at least.
Mhm.
But do you have any experiences before with like D&D and education and running it for younger people?
Yeah, I mean, I've done, I mean, not nearly as much as you. The programs that you run, which are sort of specific to that age bracket, other than when I was myself in that age bracket,
Hmm.
because I mean, I got started sixth grade or whatever. So like, but that was different. Being in high school as a freshman or sophomore and having people come over to, play was a little bit different than now. Um, I do want to comment very briefly that like one of the things that is interesting about that is that D&D is and all tabletop role-playing games on a certain level have a greater resonance, I think, for people who get into those games precisely because they are tapping into the same kind of emotional center that we have to experience within our lives. So if you play, a board game or something like that that is more intellectual, a game like Power Grid, which is like super intensely intellectual, and it's practically like doing advanced calculus, right? Like it can be enjoyable, but it's engaging a very different type of the brain, and the idea that you're going to like get into a knockdown drag out fight over that is unlikely. Before we were doing a lot of stuff with D&D and you're playing games like Monopoly, the fights that happen over that tend to be over, you're being unfair to me, or here's this real world situation of you being mean to me the way you're mean to me and something else, if you're going to fight over it. But it's not, I can't believe that we're doing this late stage capitalist allegory and you're not even thinking about it when you double charge me for landing on Boardwalk, right? Like that. That's not. It's a very different kind of mode. But D&D
Uh-huh.
is not like that. Like D&D, you're in the same kind of condition. If you're dealing with, and you have to be careful with kids, but if you're dealing with bigotry in game,
Hmm.
about a particular, racial consideration about ones that are not allowed in a city or that have particular, issues with each other. That's stuff that the kids may be running into outside of game and may not know how to process it or see it coming from older people around them.
Right.
So one thing I want to say about that is that it is the danger of Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop related games is also the great strength. And that is because it is higher stakes sometimes for these kids. It is
Yeah.
higher stakes because you're dealing with stuff that is tying into the exact same neural pathways and emotional pathways that these kids are going to deal with elsewhere. And so, but the nice thing is if something goes off the rails a bit, right? Like, I mean, this could have gone off the rails. You literally allowed it to play out. And that means they've had in a safe space, because you were always, as you say, the GM, you could always step in, you could always say no. Like you were able to sort of step in and go, hey, this is like I wouldn't allow you to do the worst example of this.
Yeah.
And yet they still got to play out what it felt like. The sense of the person being like, maybe I overdid it. The sense of the people responding, going, maybe we overreacted in response. Like
Right.
that's just, great stuff. So I wanted to comment, congratulate you on doing that, but also I think that's what's very useful about D&D. But so I have not, as you say, I have had a chance to run it for some younger kids, with like here and there, and sometimes kids that are involved with things, like with family members, and it's usually a mix more than it is all kids. It's usually a mix of kids and adults, when I do that and sort of figuring out how to manage it. To me, the thing that is the biggest sort of thing that I don't know that it's the biggest thing that I got out of it, but I think it's certainly the biggest thing that the kids that I deal with in D&D get out of it is especially DMs and teaching kids who then want to become DMs themselves is, and you brought up the word before, empathy. Like
Hmm.
the extension of having to play different characters is a very similar thing to me to what writers do if they're going to write effective characters in their work. And you can't do that by creating types, right? If you're going to have characters that are going to be effective villains, you don't do that by making them sort of mustache twirling, whatever. Like if you want them to be like characters that have some kind of full life, you have to sort of understand a little bit where the villain is coming from, not to agree with them, not to make them into like super everything is gray area. I'm not saying about that. You can make up like a straight up evil, really bad villain, right? but being able to sort of explicate what is coming, like what is human about that creature or inhuman about that creature that's doing this. That's super useful, I think, for young people to be able to get into an empathetic mode and to be able to understand what it's like to be someone different than what they are. Some cases, in an escapist case, they want to be someone different than what they are, and like they're doing this because they don't want to be what their life is.
Yeah.
And in other cases, they have never thought about what it would be like to play someone radically different from them. And to do that is then to sort of open their eyes to like, this is what it's like to be this kind of a person, right, on a basic level. And so that's where like the line of closing in on the emotional core, as you said, like this core memory is also in that movie. It's an emotional core. It's a core memory that generates a particular core emotion. And that is what D&D at its best can do. At its worst, it can play with that and it can be disastrous. But at its best, learning to cope with, to express, to understand emotions from a variety of perspectives, that's, I mean, that's spectacular work. It's also why D&D gets a lot of attention in therapy, right? Like there
Right.
are numerous examples of actual therapeutic Dungeons and Dragons work that's being done. Why? Because it's not just let's play a role, which has been in therapy forever, but it's that combined with problem solving, combined with mechanics, combined with empathizing with another group, combined with the agency and the consequences that go along with agency. Like you can do this. And they're like,
Right.
oh, I can. And you're like, yes. And if you do it, here's what
Here's what
happens.
happens. Yeah.
Right.
I'm
So
all
like
about that.
I love that kind of stuff. So to me, that I think is clearly with the kids that I've worked with, the young people that I've worked with, that is unquestionably the biggest thing that's come out of it for them is the ability to understand a variety of perspectives, even if they're just players. But if they're DMs and GMs, even to a greater extent, it gives them greater confidence. Interestingly, it makes them more confident in who they are. It doesn't confuse them. It makes them understand more facets of their own
Right.
personality. So
Right.
it's got a real depth to it, I think, in terms of the emotional core and the empathy that you can teach through this. Because I think it's important to recognize, by the way, empathy is not an innate skill. I think that humans are quickly designed to be able to pick up on empathetic cues because we're hardwired to work with each other. But that doesn't guarantee that when they emerge from the womb, they are immediately and instantaneously empathetic. We actually are quite self-connected and absorbed when we first come out because we
Yeah.
have to be, because we're like, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm this, I'm that,
I
right?
have a
But the
body. What is
I
going
have a
on?
body. What am I like? Please help my body. But
Yeah.
they quickly can learn either to be empathetic or not to be. And if you
Hmm.
look at what we're dealing with, and I don't want to get too kind of outside the bounds of this discussion, my God, if you think about what happens when you have adults that have never learned empathy, that have never learned to connect with other people, that's a big problem in
Yeah.
our politics, in our world. And so I think this is very useful to be able to teach kids empathy, and what it means to be someone else.
Yeah.
So,
I think in hearing as you were describing that too, I think something that I've learned that I could have handled that situation better next time is, I don't want to take away player agency until or if it reaches a boundary that I've set as the GM where,
sure.
you're not going to kill each other, things like that. But I probably could have as that player proposed, like I want to use my terrifying scream on my friends. In my mind, I was like, I know there's going to be consequences for this, and we're going to be prepared for it. I could have, instead of just saying, okay, go for it, and then knowing that the consequences would come, I was surprised to see that that player was surprised that there were consequences. Because
Yeah.
to me, it was obvious. It's like you're going to terrify your friends for no reason. Of course, they're going to want to have revenge against you or something. But instead, knowing that now, I could have been clear and said, okay, you can do this, but as you were just saying, you can do this, but your friends may want to retaliate because you're scaring them. Are you prepared for that idea? Now, I won't let them kill you or do anything like that, but are you prepared for your actions to have
Right.
consequences?
Right.
Then, that I think that would have made things gone even more smoothly. So there are things that I'm still constantly learning as an educator, with this age group and things that they're teaching me, and I mean, gosh, I could apply that in my own life even without this situation of teaching kids, just like in dealing with other people, talking with them
Right.
about what to
Right.
expect and stuff like that. So
Well, can I also say just quickly, that's the
Yeah.
other thing about, when a lot of these kids, their exposure to games is on the video game level. Now, you and I both play video games, but the
Hmm.
reason that I think tabletop games are a superior emotional experience to video game work, and again, and I'm not in any way denigrating. I'm playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and last episode was all the feels. Like, I mean, you can get a lot of emotion from video games, but um pixels don't have that same effect, right? Like if you
Hmm.
are playing a solo game and you do something and they were to do the equivalent of a terrifying roar. So maybe the pixels get mad. Maybe if it's well designed, like
Right.
super thoughtfully designed, maybe they get angry and retaliate. But it's very unlikely that you're going to feel it on a level of I was betrayed. You're going to be like, oh, I have to reload the game. Oh, this pixel video game thing was unhappy. It's a very different thing to see your flesh and blood in-person friend is now upset because you scared them. And
Hmm.
that's a very different thing, it seems to me. So in a way, this is the other thing too, is they're like, it's a game and I can play and do different stuff. And you're like, yeah, but it's a game with humans with messy emotions who react messily the way
Right.
that you do. And I think that's a hugely valuable lesson because you're not going to have kids mostly interacting with video games in their life. You're
Yeah.
going to have kids mostly interacting with
With
human
kids.
beings in
Yeah,
their
and
life and with
people.
other
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think too, I'm thinking about like how that situation even happened. And one thing I think that distinctly it was a perfect storm because if kids, I've had kids, of course, ask before if they can attack their friends, and that I already know that I already do that process of like, okay, first of all, why, and then if you do know the consequences, that's just sort of comes naturally to me.
Right, right, right.
But this was a slight case where I think I interpreted that, the other players could have thought it was funny. Like if I was a player at that, I mean, I can't guarantee this, but I would have thought it was kind of like, oh, you scared me, haha. Because there was no real consequence. Because really, the consequence of the mechanic going off and succeeding, which it did for a couple of the party members, is you run away for 12 seconds. That's literally it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why when I was, I think both me and the kid that did it as a joke were surprised when then the other kids were like, I go to stab them.
Well, the kids,
Um,
but think about it though. The kids lost agency for 12 seconds, and
right.
in D&D, they finally have agency that they may
Yes.
not have as 12-year-olds in their
Right.
real lives. You know what I mean? Or 10-year-olds.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, and I think maybe they're used to as well the relationship between them and the DM of the DM is the ones that the only one that can provide temporary situations where your character's terrified by something
right, right, right.
or you take damage. So then to have your friend doing this to detriment your character for no
Yeah,
reason,
it's
of course
interesting.
you're going to be mad. So yeah,
That's
it's
interesting.
really unique situations like that. And I think before I ask you your question, the question I'm going to ask you is on a totally different topic, has nothing to
Okay.
do with kids and education or anything. Um, I in that same session when they went to go fight the final boss, the one character was going to the final boss. The final boss is wearing an artifact, a crown on their head. He's like an
Okay.
undead lich who has a crown on his head, and to remove the crown is like the way to defeat him. But
Mm-hmm.
of course, the crown is like really, it's almost like magnetized to his head. There's like magic keeping it in place. And so one character was like, okay, I'm going to try it. And they were playing actually a rabbit for reasons I won't get into. They were playing a bunny, or they were essentially like wild shaped into a bunny.
Okay.
Jumped up and tried to grab the crown, and they got a natural one. And so I'm not going to say that an enemy gets a free attack on a natural one, but what I described happening is, of course, you don't grab the crown. I was like, you go to grab the crown, you jump up with your bunny hands and you grab the crown, and you realize it's way too heavy, you can't lift it off. And in my mind, I was thinking, okay, if they had not rolled a natural one, they would have then not been able to grab the crown, but then their jump finishes and then they land. That's it. But since they rolled a natural one, I was like, and then you all, I address the table, watch as your bunny friend is grabbed by the skeleton. And that's all that was going to happen. But immediately that player said, I don't like this. I'm going to leave. And then in my head, all of us looked at them like, oh, were they just joking? But then she actually got up, and
Oh,
I was like, oh. And I realized as this was an oncoming safety tools situation that was going on.
Yep.
So I said, we're going to pause things right here. First of all, if you are actually that uncomfortable, yes, feel free. You're totally fine to go leave. But that's all the skeleton does. And I started to explain, like, you know, it was just a narrative thing. And then we had this discussion about, yeah, how these games can be scary too. And like, yeah, at any time, you know,
Wow.
let me know if you guys are uncomfortable with stuff. And again, all it was just the visual of the skeleton grabbing her character that was really
Wow.
frightening to her. Um, but then we had this moment where she seemed then okay as I started to explain how things were going. Like, I don't know if she thought her character was going to die or something like that. And then one thing she said too, or I started to say, yeah, look, yeah, the skeleton grabbed you, but as you are grabbed, you look back and you see your full party of
Oh, that's
adventurers
great.
there standing behind you, ready
That's
to
great.
to get you.
That's good
And
stuff.
then this player who was the bunny is actually also the same player who did the terrifying roar earlier. And so then she said, well,
Uh,
wait, no, they're the ones earlier that said that they wanted to kill me. And so then they all felt different at that time because before they were, yeah, the terrifying roar thing happened. They were annoyed with her character, but then they all individually started to have these outcries of support towards her character, like, yeah, no, whatever, that's in the past. We're gonna save you. And then I was like,
that's
yeah,
cool.
yeah. And they were all playing princesses. I was like, yeah, princesses, are you guys gonna stand together to save your friend? And they were all like, yeah. So she stayed at the table. They freed her immediately. So just there's things
That's
like
great.
that too. It was a
That's great.
huge moment where, again, the importance of safety tools, where like the that just it triggered for me where it's like it happens very rarely, but with
Hmm.
kids totally makes sense where they're like, I'm uncomfortable, I'm gonna go leave. Um, and I think there was a certain degree where she was being a little dramatic, but I think at the root of it was actually a feeling of that she
Yeah.
really was uncomfortable.
And probably a feeling like, and maybe slight shame, like that she messed up, because
Right.
she
Yeah, yeah.
jumped up and like, yeah, like, but either way though, I mean, you handled that exceedingly well though. I mean, like because yeah, and then what that ended up being was this great teachable
Yeah.
moment. And it also
Unifying
teaches
moment between everyone.
resilience. It
Yeah.
teaches resilience, right? Like as it turned out, she could handle being grabbed
Right.
because her friends were there and her friends helped her, and also she can move beyond previous mistakes that she's been like, see
Right.
that again, you're not going to
Yeah.
get that going on around Monopoly is what I'm saying, people. Okay,
Yeah,
you're not going to get
exactly.
that. Like
And
there's just, it's a different mode.
yeah. And we can, I'm sure the question I have for you that we'll get to now is
Okay.
it doesn't have to do with safety tools, but I'm sure, I think that's something we can talk about in the future because I have
Okay.
a lot of thoughts and I'm still navigating the best use of them. And I feel like we all are. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think that's a good point in that it was, you know, I think I could have just been like, oh, you're uncomfortable. Yeah, let's pause, leave. Let's just dismiss the situation and not go any further. And I think in some situations that is totally warranted. But you're right in that, you know, through kind of analyzing it and some checks and balances of like, okay, your friends have got your back. Here's what's going on. That's literally the end of it. Yeah, she stayed. She overcame that fear. Um, yeah. So yeah, just moments like that, stuff like that. That it really is up to the DM, I feel,
Yeah,
and
it's good
also the
stuff.
players. And so
Good
yeah,
stuff.
it's a lot. It's a lot of responsibility as well when I'm training teen DMs that also work with these kids and situations like these arise. I want them to be able to have the tools and the know-how to be able to handle situations like that. But we all
Which is
would
good training for the teens
handle it
and the kids.
differently, right?
So yeah.
So yeah, again, could talk about it forever. But
Yeah.
here's my question for you on a
Okay.
totally different topic, but still
Yes,
D
yes.
and D related. So I'm curious how you, and I imagine this is going to be different for each of the campaigns that you run. How do you prep for a session? What does that look like? What do you, and specifically, what do you find in your years of GMing that you constantly need to have written down beforehand? Like when you prep, what is kind of the thing that you're like, okay, I know I need to prep this? What other things do you feel confident enough that you can improvise in the moment? So the question generally is, you know, how do you prep for a session? Do you prep different sessions differently? also just like in a literal sense, I mean, do you have folders on your computer full of notes from like sessions 2 notes, da 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 da, session 3 notes, da da da, or is it, do some sessions have zero notes? Do some sessions have paragraphs and paragraphs? Talk a little bit about your process for that and how it may differ between. Also, I know you run some things that are modules that are written by other people versus
Mhm.
stuff that is homebrew. I feel like you
Right.
do more modules, to my knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. I
So
have. I've
yeah,
started to do a little bit more homebrew over time, especially in the live events.
right.
So like, at the Klein and things like that. These are ones that I've done more homebrew, but yeah, more modules and adventures, which partly started, because when I first got started doing this, I was running, modules that did not do much hand holding at the time, by the way. The modern version of it where you have like all these big text blocks and everything, that was not, 80s like second edition modules do not have a lot of big text blocks,
Right.
and certainly not of things to say. Yeah, well, so first of all, yeah, I mean, the big thing to say right off the top is that it is different, based on different campaigns. There are some, that require more sort of, hand holding isn't the right word, but they require a little bit more kind of spin up. And
Hmm.
that's usually based on two things. It's one, how often do we meet? If you're talking about a campaign that meets once a month, normally I better have more of a recap, kind of like planning in mind. I actually find
Oh,
that doing a lot of online DMing is really useful because everything has videos. And so I can watch back the VODs, usually the last 15-20 minutes, which is of the VOD, which is a good
mm,
reminder for me about everything we talked about. That was really important before that.
I see.
But obviously I can't do that in an in-person session. So if we only meet once a month, usually it has to be a little bit more extensively. If we're meeting every other week, say, twice a month, even something like that, that usually is I don't need to have written down as much, because I will have remembered some of what happened the time before. Usually the prep process, though, regardless of what's there, is, I need to so first of all, I need to be thinking about, and I do keep notes for every campaign. Now, my notes, like your notes, are fairly legendarily detailed about we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this.
Oh, yeah.
But part of the reason for that, I think, is that as a player, which is very useful and interesting to me to see what players note as opposed to
Hmm.
what DMs note. One of my players, Jennifer Brozek, in our Eberron campaign, keeps very clear notes with very specific textual information about this is like the trigger word, for to create this like magical effect on this wand, and like this is the particular like spell that we were supposed to find details about, like things like that.
Yeah.
And there are other players who take few notes, and it's not because of laziness, it's because it's like they don't, from their point of view, they just love the vibe, like they're just sort of into the mix and they don't really need those specific kind of notes for themselves. So but that's on the player side. And the DM side, I'm always putting things that are the most significant things to which I need to return, either in a short term or a long term basis. So if something comes up in a session where, uh, someone has found a particular artifact which has a resonance for them,
Hmm.
because it ties into their lost civilization or something. I will, and if it's clear to me, and this is why it's so important as a DM to listen to your players and really watch their reactions. If I note that a player is really intrigued by a particular thing in a session, a thing that happens, or a interaction that occurs, or an artifact that's found, then you better believe I'm going to put that, and put that in all caps and be like, for right after the session, think about this. And it's usually for me now shorthand, like, think about crown and bunny grabbing or something, right? Like, I mean,
Right.
it would be something where I have a very specific thing that I need to consider. And I usually have those notes that I do during a session so that when the session concludes, I can then spend a couple of minutes, and this is very important, I think, spend a couple of minutes after the session's over by myself going over those notes and being like, okay, so this reminds me that I'm going to need to bring up this thing, and then I can type, have them encounter this first or whatever. Or I
Mm,
can be like, this person is going to have more significance, remember this in a more longer term sense. And then I can move that down on my little notepad for not the next session, but like when you hit different milestones in the campaign, typically I'll go below and I'll say, okay, this is what in this next set of adventures we need to hit these milestones. I want them to hit these milestones or these like beats at a certain moment, and those beats are largely dictated by my players, like the
Mm.
things that they found were most significant or the things that were most important to them. So I always do that after the session, a few minutes beforehand. So when I'm prepping for a session, one of the first things I do is I check those notes and I check and see, okay, what is it that I wrote the last time? What is it that I mentioned? And then I usually can remember after looking through it, yes, this is stuff that I needed to talk about this. I needed to think about this. And I always try as well, this is talking about endings, but I always try to end it on, if not a cliffhanger, at least a kind of inflection point, a big decision that needs to be made, or a moment of revelation, like they've just seen something,
Mm.
or a moment of they're getting on board the airship, right, or whatever the case may be. And the reason I do that is twofold. Number one, because it makes it interesting immediately to the players when the next session begins, but also because mnemonically, what it does is they've done studies to show that that sort of thing, when it is hooked like that, will trigger the chain of memories that led to that hook more easily. So if I know, right, that they are getting on the airship, and I know that they got on the airship because so and so was riding a broom, and so was like landing with the broom, and then they fell to the ground, and then that like created this earthquake, and then this big airship was revealed from the desert sands, or whatever. Like, I'll remember all the things that led to that moment if I have a hook that's interesting, rather than just, okay, well, we'll just, I guess that we're out of time now, so like I would rather end a little early with a bit of a hook than
Yeah.
to end super late, and just sort of like, okay, well, we've done everything we can do now, and then we're all sort of exhausted, because then it's harder for me to kind of pick that up the next time. So I always try to pick up on those notes that are there, and then go into the next stage. Also, prepping maps is really important, making sure that I have my maps in order if I'm using them, making sure that I have any handouts in order. I liked what you had to say before about the character pictures. Like, images are really important, and this is even if I'm not playing online. If I'm playing offline too, are there certain handouts and images that I'm going to be showing to my players that I want to have prepared, usually at the beginning?
Mm.
That's something which is really useful that I want to prepare too. And then the last thing is as I'm sort of setting up for this, to, in my mind, go, where would I like us to get by the end of the session? Now, this coming session, the session we're about to do, like, what do I think we're likely to be able to get to? Where would I like to get to? Now, it's important that, just as a writer, when you write an outline, you don't want to become slave to the outline. You
Mm.
don't want to say, well, I wrote the outline, so that means I have to do chapter 13 has to be this guy. Like,
Right.
that's not a good idea. It's not the way that anyone writes organically, and it's especially a bad idea in a collaborative storytelling environment like D&D,
Yeah.
where no plan survives contact with a player, right? So like, the player is going to do some weird things. So you don't want to be slave to that. You don't that's bad railroading, which we talked about in the show before. But you do want to have a sense yourself of where you'd like to go, so that you can be gently guiding at the beginning if it's clear that the players don't know what they want to do. The players often will be like, I totally want to go this way. And then, assuming that you're presenting consequences and all that, you let them do what they want to do, and you proceed along, and therefore, what it is that maybe your original plan is not going to come to fruition about where we're going to get this session, but at least where they're doing, and you can use that to build where you hope to go next session. So you have one macro arc for the campaign, you have smaller arcs for beats, couple of adventures at a time, and then you have micro arcs for a session. And
Mm.
if you can, in your mind, say, I'd like to have them meet this guy during this session, that's a good
Yeah.
micro arc to have, and so that's useful as well.
Wow.
So it's prep at the end of the last session,
Yeah.
it's prep at the beginning of the next session, thinking about those ideas, having a sense of what you want to go with beats, tokens, maps, and all that sort of thing as necessary. And then the other thing, which I haven't done as much of as I want to, but I'm going to start doing it, I think, much more, is have the players doing the recaps in front of a live audience. That's useful, but even without it, I think it's useful even for them. It helps me to know what they picked up on,
Right.
which is super useful as a cue. And it can also be helpful for the players to be reminded about what happened rather than me being like, so what happened 6 weeks ago was blah, blah, blah. Because sometimes for players who are really busy, like, they may not remember all those things as well. So I'm going to try to incorporate more of that sort of recap work over time. But that is something I'm just starting to scratch the surface of myself. So
Hmm.
that's typically what I do.
Is there what do you think is the balance for you of, when you have your notes at the end of a session, which by the way, I wanted to mention that sometimes if I remember and I'm not too in the moment, I will note down what is happening as it's happening as I'm GMing. Or
Mhm.
if especially if
Yes.
there's a moment.
I do that all the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
All the time.
I often forget because I'm running the game.
Yeah, sure, of
The
course.
easiest time to do so is when I have one uh recurring professional campaign at the moment, and otherwise just a lot of one shot random gigs, and then my kids every week. But in my recurring campaign, session 60 something that we're on right now, I've been DMing for these people for over a year. um, they love role play between each other. And so there will be moments in sessions of our campaign where they will just be playing out a whole scene. And I get to sit back and just not
It's
have to
my
worry about
favorite thing
stuff.
in the world to do that,
Yeah.
man. Just like you, I like
And
because it's
so
great.
oftentimes I will like, oh yeah, I should write down what's happening because I'm going to forget later.
Right.
Um, so it's funny too when you end a session and you take some time deliberately to write down what happened and to like
Definitely.
make notes and remember
Like
things.
5 minutes. It doesn't have to be like a
Yeah,
long
yeah, yeah.
thing, but 5 to 10 minutes.
I need to do that more, but usually what happens with me is I end a session, we end the call or whatever if it's virtual, and the camera turns off and I'm like, ugh, and I get up and I just run away. I just run. I leave my room. I turn off my light. I turn
You
off
were
my
the bunny
camera.
that's been grabbed by the skeleton.
Yeah,
I'm going to
yeah.
leave.
Uh, yeah, I'm
Why?
just
Well,
like,
wait, though. Why? Is it like just
I don't
because
know. I
it's
think it's I mean, part of it might be just that my room gets like hot and I've been sitting for so long. Been sitting for so long. I don't want,
oh,
and just in general been sitting for so long that I don't want to sit there for another 5 minutes and like
DMing is great. I
no.
can't wait to escape and not
Yeah.
do it anymore. I'm just leaving right now.
But it's
Oh my
just for that
God.
moment. I thoroughly enjoy the sessions, and it's not like it's not a sigh of exasperation of like, oh, please let it end. But as soon as it does end, I'm like, let me get out of this room. And even if it was a great session, especially if it was a great session, I don't know. That's what happens with me. I don't know if any other DMs could
I
relate
mean,
to that,
that's
but like,
honestly recording sessions is really helpful for that, though.
yeah,
Even if it's for your own private use. If
yeah,
you're in person, audio recording it, like
hmm,
a little audio recorder. I have a little Sony audio recorder that's like 10 hours. It records on a USB. You can plug it directly into a computer. I use it for panel recordings and stuff, but you can use it for anything. And that's an example of something where you can record it and then you can fast forward and play it
yeah.
towards the end if you want to pick up on that stuff, so you don't have to feel necessary to like stick around. Although that is very funny. Just like,
Yeah.
I want to
Um,
get out, Yeah.
but the follow up I was going to ask you to moving on from that is how much do you feel like you have to write out versus just having in your head? So like when a lot of my prep I do, I really should be doing throughout the week, but to be honest, if I have a couple hours free before I'm supposed to run a session, that's when I do my prep because it's on
Hmm.
my mind. I'm about to do it. It's whatever. Um, so I'll sit down, and I think this is one area where I know we differ very greatly. In that, in some cases, if I feel like there's a big moment, or especially if there's there's been situations where uh, conversations have happened between two notable NPCs in my campaign, um, at different points. And so when that kind of conversation, like there's going to be a lore drop, or a player is overhearing something between two characters,
Hmm.
um, it's happened almost 3 or 4 times now where I actually will write out like a full cutscene, sentence by sentence, and I will read it as if it were a script between these
Okay.
two characters.
Okay.
Not, and I don't do that for every interaction that any NPC has, and maybe sometimes for an NPC, I'll prepare like a quote or a catch, not a catchphrase, but like an idiom or an aphorism that they'll
Yeah,
say that capitulates how they think. Um, but there, like, if I were to go through my notes, there are some sessions where I have like highlighted like exactly what I'm going to say in some moments. And I feel like, and I've acknowledged this too with your play of NPCs, that you just have your gift of gab with NPC dialogue just sort of like evokes out of you at any given moment, I feel.
yeah,
And so I'm curious with NPCs, but also just in general, when you know that a certain, when you have, like you said, your micro and your macro arcs, do you
right.
write those down to cement the idea that they should happen, or do you help feel like that helps your memory that that is a thing that's there for that session, or do you have some sessions where you don't need even need to write a thing? Like I, to be clear, I have like a folder in the equivalent of a Google Drive for all 60 plus sessions of my campaign, and each document, each, session 65, session
Yeah.
64, each is a document with
I
notes.
have one massive notepad sheet is what
You
I have.
do?
Like yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I have
For
separate
each campaign, but still.
yeah, I have separate documents for every session. And sometimes I'll copy, sometimes things happen much more slowly than you think as a DM. So I just like copy paste what was in the last session. Like if, especially if combat happens, combat takes so long that I'm just like, well, we didn't get to that plot point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Copy paste. So we'll do it this time. So anyway, that's my curiosity is like, do you, are your notes like, are there things that you feel like you have to write down before the session starts?
Yeah, I
Or,
mean, well, so yeah, there's a couple things there. I mean, so yes, there are some things that I have to write down, but they tend not to be dialogue. And part of that is, and I'll like, yeah, I'm not to be like everyone has strengths and weaknesses, right? One
yep,
of my strengths is dialogue, and that's because for two reasons. Number one, because I'm a professional author, so for I've been writing for 25 years, and I've been professionally published for almost 20, and so like I do this for a living. I teach it for a living. I like I
yeah,
do a lot of thinking about dialogue, so I don't need to write that stuff down because that's just sort of very natural to me.
mm,
And the second thing is that I have a public speaking background and an improvisational background, and I was very, very good at it. I was internationally ranked, very good at it. So that's just something that happens to be my thing. What I am terrible at is drawing images of any type that anyone would recognize, unless you want to have a character that's a peanut. If you want a peanut, I can draw peanuts. Other than that, I am a horrific illustrator,
I
drawer.
mean, same.
But you know what I mean, though. Like you see Perkins and some of these people with these gorgeous maps. I'm like,
I
dude,
mean,
how do you even do?
oh yeah, you
Perkins
mean
Perkins
like
is great at maps.
top down? Oh yeah, I
Yeah, yeah,
guess
yeah.
so. I
I'm
guess
talking
so.
about like with like the flame. I'm like,
Yeah.
how do you even what do you
I can do that. I haven't done it in a while because there's, well, in much the same thing. There are all these wonderful
there are all
actual
these
artists
tools
that
now,
draw
right,
these
right,
things
right,
for
right,
Roll
right.
20
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah, yeah. No, there are, but
all
like,
these
and I mean,
Patreons,
like
whatever.
I can follow graph paper, but I'm saying, you know what I mean? Like, it's not,
Yeah.
that doesn't, that like, so, but I visualize all that stuff in my head pretty well. So whatever. The point being that like, so dialogue is a strength of mine. So no, I don't write that down. What I do write down, and I write this down, even though again, I'm used to doing these things, but I think this is important. And in fact, I'd like us at some point to have a discussion about this on GenGMs in the future. Theme, theme. Um, a lot
Hmm.
of times people hear theme and they think, well, so we're talking about like,
Sci-fi,
yeah,
fantasy.
right, exactly. Musical theme. No. But no, but they think, so this is like a meaning and you're trying to give people to understand a meaning. And it is sort of a little bit related to that, but it's not really. The idea of a theme are the core values around which this adventure is based. Is this about a world in which there is someone who needs to be overthrown because of their tyranny? Is this a world in which these players work for the tyrant? And maybe the tyrant isn't a bad guy, and maybe the chaos that waits on the other end of the overthrow of the tyrant wouldn't be a great thing, or whatever. What are the major themes of the overall campaign? I want to write those down because when I mentioned those little micro arts, those beats, those are the things that I want to come out in a given session. So, for example, in the Eberron campaign, my long-running Eberron campaign, there were two characters that were going to be speaking to each other about something very serious, which is that they are sisters, and they both work for the same organization, the King's Citadel, which is like this special forces type of thing.
Mm.
And they had been told, one of the people in one of the sisters had been told by her house, which is not part of the King's Citadel but knows about it, that there was this spy who had been captured by this group of people that they were going to infiltrate the enclave of. And so basically it was either rescue this person, or if you can't do that, kill them. Because if they are allowed to stay and they are turned, like, it would be disastrous.
Right.
It would give all this information, right?
Wow.
So she had let this, so the person who had been told this let her sister know, while the people, for a variety of reasons I can't tell you, need to come watch the VOD yourself, but while they are being brought out of this this enclave, having done what they set out to do, they're being carried out in these crates to basically escape from this enclave, which is on the look for them. This person is a Kalashtar with telepathic powers, and they can sense that there is someone in distress in the area of the cells. And it was because they were looking, like they were actively looking for this. A pretty good guess that it was going to be this person, that was likely to be what it was. So they do what is known as a psychic glance, which only works with the name of the person specifically. So they didn't just randomly kill anybody.
Right.
And they did that. The person in question, now they don't know what they did to them, but I mean, I know that person had a hit point like left, so it killed them.
Wow.
So the conversation that was going on in this adventure in our session were between the two sisters about what was it that they thought about what had happened. Was the sister going to be upset that her sister did this, thinking she was helping the sister, like, because, that's what the sister had been told to do? What ended up happening was the sister ended up feeling like she had realized for the first time how much weight her words have, right? And how much weight. So what I did in preparation for this, I knew they were going to role play this out. The psychic glance thing had just happened at the end last before. That was basically where we ended last session. So I knew that was going to be on their mind. They had escaped the enclave, so they wanted to RP this out. And so for me, I wrote down a couple of themes, which was sisterhood or organizational loyalty.
Wow.
I wrote down a theme of what price will you pay, right? Because that was another thing that was going to come up. And consequences of the actions to their future familial relationship. Now, I wrote these things down not because I was going to be refereeing or moderating them, but because I knew that those things were going to end up flowing into the rest of the session, because this was going to be an intense, and it was like a 45-minute, super awesome, totally compelling, intense RP session. So I'm not going to be like, great, all right, so you go to a bakery or something, right? Like, I knew that this was going to have to be dealt with by the rest of the party. The players are listening, of course, but their characters aren't there. So knowing those themes meant that I was then able to use that theme to prepare what was likely to happen next. And what ended up happening next was a combat in free fall, during which people that had been knocked off this airship were scattered in different directions. What's the theme? You already paid a cost. You already paid a price for choosing your sister over your technical responsibilities to your organization. Here are all these people falling from the ship. You're going to go after the artifact that's falling from the ship. You're going to go after the people, right?
Boy.
So all of that sort of played into it. And it was good. Now, that was partly a part of the adventure was going to happen anyway. But the way it was framed was coming out of that RP, thing that had just happened in the first half of the session. And I knew that was likely to happen. So what I prepare in those situations, what I write down are themes. Again, not chains, not you have to do this or else, not I don't care what you want to talk about, you're going to talk about my theme. Just things that I think are likely to be a part of what that session is involved. What's very useful for this is episode titles. When you say something like Aftermath or what cost freedom. If you ever look at like TV sessions, a good example of this is the original Star Trek. Episode titles like Who Mourns for Adonis, or The Devil Within, or something. Like, these things are so evocative of
Yeah.
what the episode ends up being about. It really is kind of talking about the theme.
Mm.
Um, is there in truth no beauty? And like that really
Wow.
helps shape the way I think the episode plays out and the way that people experience it. So
Mm.
that's what I write down for sure. Besides the things we talked about are absolutely themes, not dialogue, because I feel like I can do that once I understand the characters. I can inhabit that space, but theme. Whether I always remember the accent of every character is another thing. I'm pretty good at accents, I think, but I need to sometimes I'm like, if they're like, oh yeah, we're going back 6 months to find our good friend Rodolfo. I'm like, what the hell, Rodolfo? And I'm like, yeah, Rodolfo with the accent. Like that sometimes can be hard. But no,
He
that's what you do.
sounded
You
like
wite
this,
down
right?
themes. But
Yeah.
yeah, I
He
was
was
like, yeah,
this
that
voice.
Italian accent. No,
Yeah.
Rodolfo's French. I'm like, right.
That's what I
That's
said.
naturally French, anyway.
Yeah.
But no, seriously, but like themes are the thing that I write down, and that I think is super useful for me.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting in that running a session, and it almost feels like you are, if you, as the GM, you are putting up a a wall that is the theme, and you are bouncing a tennis ball off of it,
Right.
as you
And
play.
I want them to do, I mean, like again, I'm not locking them into it. Like
Right.
I'm bouncing it off of it based on what they are sort of developing. Like a lot of
Mm.
times the themes will shift. I mean, like that came from their
Yeah.
actions, right? So I was like, okay, so like this is the theme of what they're playing out. There in that same campaign, there was one example where our mutual friend Tren
Hmm.
um had him, he was in the gray, the Mournland, which is this bizarre, weird place where there was this massive magical cataclysm and whatever. Anyway, he's on this weird carousel that sort of creates memories,
Right.
and
I
he
remember you
sees like the
describing that.
falling of this thing, and
Yeah.
like he was just like thunderstruck by it. But the reason I'm bringing that up here again is that thematically that character's loss is something we didn't talk much about. We talked about his intelligence and about his work with elementals, and does that bother him that they're enslaved or not enslaved. But the idea that he experiences loss and what it is that triggers those feelings of loss, that's great stuff, and that's a theme that I then definitely write down because it colors what the rest of the players are doing going
Mm.
forward. So
Yeah, I think that's good for me because I tend to, I think, subconsciously think about theme. Like you just have a sense, maybe as a DM,
uh-huh.
of what is going on. But that being one of the main things that you write, I think is very valuable. And I think I'm gonna maybe try to do that as well because now
Because
that I,
everything springs from it, dialogue too,
right, yeah,
springs
yeah,
from that
and
theme.
it can help to reinforce, yeah, like you said, literally everything that you do. Like in situations where I'm writing paragraphs and paragraphs to remind myself of what I'm going to say or what I'm going to do or what I'm going to describe, instead just keeping the theme in mind. Because I think that there is a balance to this aspect of prep as a DM as well, of the question of how much do you have to write down ahead of time versus how much can you just rely on your own ability in the moment.
Sure.
And
And
so,
more experience can change that too.
right.
I wanted to say quickly that Sir Laurence Olivier, famous actor, was once wanted to know in playing a character, I believe it was from Oedipus Rex, but I'm not sure. How do you play this? And the teacher told him, play as if the gods were always at excuse me, I got that wrong. Play as if as like I was like trying to say it and I was choking on saliva, which is not play as if you're choking. No, play as if the gods were always at your heels. And now and you think to yourself, you're like, okay, well, that sounds like goofy, but if you think about the idea that the gods are not only omnipresent in classic Greek drama, but that they are always like, if you screw up ever, they are always around you, as the Greeks believed. The ocean, the harvest, the storm, the everything that ever happened was because the gods were watching you like this.
Mm,
That creates a kind of paranoia and an obsession with the divine that then informs all of the acting you do for it. Now, Laurence Olivier, by that point, was a highly accomplished actor, and there are actors who can't learn that way, and they're method actors, and they have to get really into Daniel Day-Lewis would have been like, "What the hell does that mean?" That. So it's different for every actor, but like
yeah.
the point is that to me is again theme. It's basically telling them the gods are always at your heels. And if you keep that in mind, then it means you're going to play more paranoid. You're going to play almost in a rushed sense. You're always going to feel like I don't have time to work things out myself. There will be maybe a haunted expression in your eyes because there's
Mm,
always this sense that the gods are hovering, waiting to see what you do or don't do.
mm,
And so, that's about theme. And so I talk about that with my creative writing students, same way, theme.
interesting. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's cool, and that we should too. Sometime we could exchange notes or like show each other how we do our notes or something like
Totally.
that as
Yeah.
part of
I
it
want to see
also.
your all your image boards and stuff. You show me some of them, but like
Yeah. I
like all of the image collections in the Roll20 pages and stuff.
oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, I have lots and lots of Roll20 pages because yeah, whenever they are, and you do sort of the same thing. When they're at a certain location, I have art of that location that
Yeah,
they
yeah, right.
we sit on and all that. But yeah, I'm subscribed to like 20 different artist Patreons. They all draw top down
Oh
VTT
God, it's
maps.
so I know. It's
Yeah,
maps for me.
it's
It's maps,
maps.
man. If you have good like evocative maps,
Hmm.
that does so much for me. Even if they're not going to be in the map, just the fact that I'm looking at it just gives me so many thoughts about the
Yeah.
people that live in a map like this, the creatures that live in a map, that.
Hmm.
So anyway.
That's an interesting point too. On a quick tangent of that, of part of how I market myself, or actually that's not true. Not I don't use it to market myself really, but when a session happens, part of what I do to justify the fact that it is a professional campaign is that I have artwork and I have maps for basically every combat. Um, and not saying that a pro DM has to do this. I mean, our one of our friends, Mike from Unmade Gaming, his GMing style is completely theater of the mind. He has even professionally, like he doesn't use maps whatsoever. And so I was actually just talking to him recently because he was asking for my advice in what I do running in-person gigs. And I was like, well, part of what I feel like justifies my professional DMing when I go to an in-person gig, like I did a couple days ago at a person's house in San Francisco. I bring all of my painted miniatures, my 3D Dwarven Forge battle maps. Like I
Nice.
have the whole the whole thing. I also do have though, and I kind of make it a selling point as I'm there, where I'm like, this year's the 50th anniversary of D&D, and I I also have just flat, almost like graph paper, but they are like texturized, simple maps on flat 2D paper. And so what I do in many of these one shots is I have just a flat map that they can put a miniature on, and then we have a couple encounters on flat maps. And then for
Hmm.
the big boss fight, I bring out the 3D fully painted
Nice.
Dwarven Forge stuff.
Nice.
Um, but yeah, it's interesting. My point being that a lot of what ends up happening in locations and campaigns, interestingly, gets dictated by the map that I find. So
Mhm.
oftentimes, if I know that I'm looking for an encounter to happen in a forest, and then I find a forest map that's close enough to what I had in my mind, but then the artist added like a log fallen over in a specific way, or like there's a camp over there, then oftentimes either I crop it out, or in many cases I just make it a part of the story. And
Yes.
so the artist may never
Yes.
know, but there are so many occasions where if it isn't going to break anything that I had planned, then it becomes a part of what I had planned.
Totally. The Zay Peku, which I've talked about
Right.
before, which are great map makers. They actually, because I subscribe to their Patreon, when they
Yep.
send maps out,
Same.
they also put you know how they put that thing where they're like, we imagined it being like this, but maybe your
Right.
party could do this, or maybe you could do that, like, which shows that they're thinking about it could be like this, but also maybe your party's interested in making it like this, which is really helpful because again, it's you can take it and then sort of run with it. And I absolutely have done that for some like in-person live events in
Mm.
front of an audience using maps as inspiration. Yeah.
What games of yours do you use those sorts of maps with? Because I know like with Esper Genesis, we had a good number of maps, but a lot of our combats were also theater of mind. And with
Right.
Expedition from the Mysterious Peaks, we've only gotten like two or three
That's right.
maps for our combats, which
That's
I
right.
feel like maybe because it's a module, and at certain aspects of that. But like, so if you're using Chepeku maps as an example, like what are you using what campaign are you using those maps for?
So for my live, like for example, I'm in the midst of the second Forbidden Library trilogy of adventures, really,
Hmm.
which I've been running at Gen Con. And I'm going to be running the last of the second trilogy of adventures, with which you were intimately familiar, the first trilogy,
Right.
at Gen Con. And so one of the inspiration um, for the first of those trilogy of adventures, set in the same world, but not, related, but not directly with the same people necessarily,
Mm,
was just literally I don't want to spoil it for the time that you might be playing it, but a map in which there were a lot of mirrored parallel rooms that I thought were really interesting.
mm,
And I immediately got this idea of sort of playing off of binaries and what we think of in terms of on, off, night, day, that sort of thing.
right.
And it created the whole, in fact, that name of that adventure is Night and Day. And it was largely inspired by seeing the way that, say, Pecco had made this sort of
Huh,
map structure. So I've used that for that trilogy of adventures
I see.
as an
And
example. So,
and you said that that was a part of a Gen Con series or
yep,
trilogy that you're doing?
yep.
Okay,
The
so
first
that's
the first trilogy were the Forbidden Library that you've now played through the first two parts of.
right.
The third part will be coming hopefully soon,
Hmm.
and then the second trilogy is now being that all those three were run
Oh,
at the symposium. Now the second trilogy of adventures, which is
is it
again,
a sequel to what
it
I've
is.
done on? Oh,
Yeah, it
okay, I
is.
didn't know
It
that.
is a sequel,
That's
but it
cool.
doesn't necessarily have to involve the same characters. It can, but
Mm,
it is sort of related to the events. They weave into what happens in this trilogy, but it's not a direct, one to one. This happens and then this next thing happens. So yeah.
right. Okay,
So
that's cool.
yeah.
All right. Well, sometimes I know we do th two questions or three questions, but I think
These are
we
pretty good answers, I think.
yeah, I think we're good here and knowing too you still have to get home and
Well,
all
yeah,
that
my
as well.
flag's gone. I can no
Yeah,
longer see
yeah.
it.
Your
So
flag
like,
has been surrounded by inky darkness. So
and I'm
you
on a
should probably
campus
check
where the
that
gates
out.
might close, and they'll be
Oh,
like, I'll
yeah.
be stuck forever. And
But no, I think these were great. Talking about D&D as it relates to kids and what they can learn. If you ever run out of questions for me, just ask me that question again, and I'll have a
something
new
we've never
story for you.
talked about before.
Yeah,
It's,
I mean,
you're,
I'll
yeah,
have a new story every time.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
I learned so much from these kids, uh, and then talking about prepping for
Yeah, the
sessions.
prep question was really interesting too. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so great. Okay,
That's good
well,
stuff. That's what you can get from us people.
yes,
And like we said, please spread the word. Let everyone know if you like this. Please leave comments yourselves too. If you have questions for us or the things you're like you want to, please send them our
yeah.
way. Because we love to hear them.
Yeah, if they're if we feel like they'd be good for the podcast and you ask a question, then it might actually become one of the questions that we ask during an episode too.
That's right.
So,
Yep.
yeah. Well, great. This has been Gregory Wilson, the covered in education.
This has been Zach Clay, he of the 5 hour plus of stories of kids
Yep,
related to D&D.
great. And we'll see you for the next installment of Gen GMs, which the next one, editing all over the place. Every word, boom, pow, uh
I would
Wilhelm
can't
scream. Yeah. So that's it.
That's us.
All right, y'all. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
And I was about to end the meeting. Let me not do that. Let me stop the recording. Okay. Farewell.